You might think pirates spent their days swinging from ropes, shouting "Arr!" and hunting buried treasure, but their biggest enemy wasn't rival buccaneers or the Royal Navy. It was chalky, clumsy navigation in the middle of the vast, endless ocean. Seriously, back in 1696, pirates didn't exactly have GPS or Google Maps, so getting lost was way too easy. Let me tell you something wild about how these salty sea dogs turned something as creepy as bones into navigation tools that helped them plot the high seas with surprisingly decent accuracy. And trust me, the solutions they came up with were so bizarre and clever, you'd think it came straight out of a macabre pirate ghost story. Except it actually worked. Picture this: a pirate ship with 50 crew members sailing somewhere off the Caribbean. The year is 1696, and the sun's blazing, the salt air is thick, and all anyone really wants is to get to a safe harbor before the next storm hits. But the catch is, traditional tools like compasses and charts didn't always cut it. Electronics, forget it, they hadn't invented the switch yet, and even the best sea maps were sketchy at best, sometimes literally scribbled by a drunk sailor. The biggest hurdle: they couldn't figure out exactly where they were on the endless blue canvas of the ocean, especially when the weather turned grim and landmarks vanished. They needed a way to measure direction and distance reliably, to not suddenly find themselves in shark-infested waters, or worse, in the middle of nowhere. Now here's the kicker. Pirates had some of the dumbest, funniest failed attempts trying to get their bearings before they hit on their bony breakthrough. One favorite was using scraps of wood nailed to their steering wheels, hoping the position of the sun would help. But that mostly just made the ship look haunted, and no one could actually read it. Another brilliant idea involved dropping chunks of pork into the water to estimate current flow, by how fast the pigs bloated and floated away. Bad idea, really bad idea. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, and the pork smelled so bad the crew nearly mutinied. You can probably guess how that ended. Let's just say no one wanted pork chops for a while, and navigation remained a guessing game. But here's where it gets interesting, because pirates figured out something clever that turned their gruesome supplies into surprisingly effective navigation tools. It started with something you wouldn't expect: bones, human bones to be precise. Now before you start imagining pirates gnawing on femurs like they were beef jerky, hear me out. See, when pirates plundered ships or battled enemies, their victims, and occasionally their own dead, left behind an unfortunate pile of skeletons. Instead of just tossing bones overboard or burning them for spooky campfire stories, they began noticing something peculiar. When carefully carved and marked, these bones could serve as primitive but effective tools for navigation. Their real genius was in using long, straight bones like femurs or ribs, fashioning them into protractors and rulers to measure angles against the horizon and the position of the stars. Pirates didn't have a name for it back then, but what they were making was essentially a low-tech sextant or astrolabe, their version of a navigation instrument, way cheaper and spookier than the expensive brass gadgets the Royal Navy had. They'd carve notches or lines into the bones, creating basic scales that allowed them to measure the elevation of the sun or key stars above the horizon, which then helped estimate latitude. Now, I know what you're thinking: bones as navigation tools. Sounds like something from a horror movie, but it was 70% effective, better than any guesswork or rotten pork floaters. The science behind this accidental genius is actually pretty straightforward. Long bones are rigid, lightweight, and easy to carve into shapes that could hold angle measures. When held up to the sky, with a properly carved scale, pirates could estimate how high a star was. And since certain stars rose and set at predictable angles depending on where you were on the globe, the pirates could roughly calculate their north-south position. They hacked around with the designs too, making sure the bone ruler had a hole drilled through it to attach a small plumb line, often just a piece of string with a tiny weight like a metal ball or even a coin. Gravity would pull the plumb line straight down, and the pirate could see where the string crossed the notches on the bone to get their angle. Honestly, it's basically a version of the tools early astronomers used. Only the pirates didn't have fancy workshops, so they improvised with what they had. Their version of a primitive, mobile observatory carved from scraps after a battle. A perfect example of this is the notorious Captain Bartholomew Bonclaw Jones of the Caribbean Fleet in 1696. Yes, they actually called him Bonclaw, mostly because he had a wooden prosthetic hand shaped like a skeletal claw, but also because he pioneered this bone navigation method. He was too crafty and superstitious not to experiment with every scrap of human remains on his ship. During one particularly memorable voyage, his crew used a large femur bone carved with lines spaced to count degrees. They hung a string with a lead shot through a hole, making the thing swing like a pendulum. By sighting the North Star and measuring its angle, they navigated from Tortuga to Port Royal without hitting any mysterious sandbars or getting hopelessly lost in a storm. Funny enough, this was a massive improvement over their previous attempts, with makeshift compasses made from rusted nails and magnetized bits that often pointed randomly, usually toward the rum barrels. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by trusting magnetic witchcraft instead of bones. Now, not everything about this bone navigation method was picture perfect. For one, bones were slippery when wet, which, on a pirate ship that wasn't dry for more than 5 minutes thanks to ocean spray and less than stellar hygiene, meant tools got slimy and hard to grip. Pirates solved this by rubbing the bones with tar or pine resin to improve their grip and durability, which took care of the stickiness, but gave the instruments an aroma that was equal parts pirate and pine tree graveyard. Probably not great for impressing ladies at port, but hey, practicality beat perfume. Another problem: bones could splinter or crack, especially in the humid, salty air. Replacing these tools required constant scavenging, or keeping a stockpile of human bones from unfortunate prisoners or victims. Morbid. Absolutely. Effective. Surprisingly so. Pirates learned to treat these bones with boiled oil to harden them against moisture and rough handling, increasing their lifespan from a miserable 2 weeks to almost a month at sea. A huge deal when you're trying to avoid a surprise landing on the wrong continent. Oh, and in case you're wondering where they got the measuring scale marks, well, some of it was trial and error, but many pirates learned from Portuguese and Dutch sailors known for early navigation science. They mimicked etched degrees, but with the added pirate flair of tally marks looking almost like tallying kills or stolen loot. Because nothing says deadly and precise like marking a bone with tallies of your victims. But wait, it gets better. Pirates also realized that the size and shape of different bones could specifically target different stars or the sun at different times of day. They identified femurs as perfect for midday sun measurements because of their length and thickness, while ribs worked better for evening star tracking because you could curve them slightly to follow the horizon line more naturally. Talk about anatomical ingenuity. And here's something that seldom makes it into history books. Pirates sometimes personalized their bone instruments with crude engravings or even small carved skulls to honor the dead. Some believed it gave them nautical luck or protection from curse, really pushing the whole spooky vibe. I guess even pirates had moments where superstition beat science. This bone-based navigation wasn't just some eerie gimmick thrown together by drunken sailors. It was a serious survival strategy. In the age of wooden ships and iron wills, knowing where you were could mean the difference between finding treasure, walking the plank, or worse, being stranded on a godforsaken island with nothing but rats and wailing ghosts to keep you company. So next time you picture a pirate, don't just think of swaggering sword fights and parrots on shoulders. Imagine them hunched over a femur bone, string in hand, squinting at the horizon, calculating their course with the kind of grim, bone-chilling precision that only desperate seamen could dream up. Because that's the real story behind how pirates transformed something as everyday and creepy as bones into vital navigation tools that even some of the better-funded naval fleets didn't yet fully understand. Hold on tight, because the story doesn't stop at bones. Pirates' navigation experiments gave rise to some other truly bizarre and hilarious methods you won't believe they tried before settling on the bony sextants. From floating candles in barrels to crab-shell compasses, it's a wild ride of trial, error, and some seriously disgusting attempts at mastering the open seas. And I'll tell you all about those next, just after this. But pirates had a bigger problem than just figuring out direction. Knowing where they were was only half the battle. Even if you managed to plot your course using a spooky bone protractor, you still needed something to keep the ship afloat, and the crew fed while you tried not to starve or drink seawater straight from the ocean, which, spoiler alert, tastes worse than a barnacle infestation. You see, back in 1696, Fresh water was the real treasure every pirate craved. A crew of 50 would guzzle roughly 50 gallons daily, maybe more if the Caribbean sun was roasting their backsides, and storing water was a logistical nightmare. Ships like the famous Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's flagship, could carry a few hundred gallons in barrels, but that only lasted a couple of weeks before it started to taste like old gym socks soaked in salt. Pirates tried all sorts of disgusting methods to stretch their water supplies, often with hilariously tragic results. One popular idea was to collect rainwater using sails rigged like giant, soggy sponges funneling into barrels. Bad idea. Really bad idea. While rainwater itself was mostly pure, pirates didn't have modern filtration, so the fabric of the sails, covered in sweat, salt, and God knows what else, contaminated the water with a cocktail of grime and microscopic sea critters. Let's just say some crew members ended up with stomachs that sounded like bongos at a voodoo ceremony. And it wasn't just rainwater. Pirates also tried filtering seawater through layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth, thinking it'd magically turn salt water into drinkable water. Turns out, they overlooked the pesky problem of dissolving salt crystals. Even the cleverest pirate brain couldn't invent a desalination plant out of rocks and seaweed. The result? A bitter, brackish slurry that was about as refreshing as licking barnacles. You can probably guess how that ended. Lots of thirsty pirates grumbling, and a few desperate enough to take shots of acidic lemon juice to replace water, which only made matters worse. But here's where things get fascinating. Some pirate captains got creative by coupling their bone navigation tools with a surprisingly practical water purification hack, using what they had on hand. See, pine resin, already famous for sealing up ship cracks and making rigging waterproof, turned out to have antimicrobial properties pirates accidentally exploited. They'd coat their water barrels and sides with pine resin, making the containers less hospitable to bacteria, and then use crude charcoal filters made from burnt wood scraps in the galley to strain out sediment and bad bits. It wasn't perfect, but this method extended the water's freshness from 3 days to nearly a week, a game changer when sailing through the Caribbean's scorching heat. Think of it like their version of a primitive Brita filter, combined with packing their own gallon essentials kit for 16th century swashbucklers. This resourcefulness wasn't limited to just water, though. Food preservation was another daily struggle on the open sea. Without refrigeration or airtight containers, pirates had to rely on salt, smoke, and surprisingly, vinegar to keep their feasts from assaulting their senses after a couple of weeks. Salted pork and beef were staples. Imagine 63-gallon barrels of meat swimming in salt brine, but it was a minefield of potential disaster. If the salting was off, the meat could mold or get infested with maggots, which, let me tell you, the only thing worse than maggots is the smell that follows them around. Pirates referred to this as the curse of the squirming bits. And there's a historical account from a pirate ship called the Flying Dragon in 1695, where so much maggot-infested salted beef was loaded on board that the entire crew went on a week-long strike, refusing everything but hardtack and rum. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation because suddenly pirates were picky eaters whining about their grub. Now, what really saved the day wasn't some magic spice or secret recipe. It was vinegar. Pirates figured out that soaking salted meat in a weak vinegar solution reduced bacterial growth and kept flies at bay, turning what would normally be a swampy meat sludge into something borderline edible for several more weeks. Vinegar, with its 3.5% acetic acid concentration, was basically the pirates' all-natural preservative spray. It was like having a raw seafood restaurant on the ship that somehow managed not to turn the galley into a biohazard zone. This vinegar trick wasn't an official revelation. It spread by word of mouth among crews and became standard practice aboard ships like the Revenge and the Adventure Galley by the late 1690s. But keeping people alive wasn't just about water and food. Hygiene aboard those wooden death traps was an all-out war zone, with diseases like scurvy and dysentery lurking around every corner. Pirates shared one latrine bucket for dozens of men, limited fresh clothes and bathing. Well, let's just say it was a rarity unless a storm forced the entire ship to take a salty bath all at once. Pirates faced a vicious cycle. Poor hygiene led to illness. Illness meant fewer hands to hoist sails or man the cannons, and that could mean death by enemy fire or the sea itself. Trying to break this cycle, pirates experimented with daily routines that would make anyone from the 21st century scratch their heads. One popular but ill-fated method involved a smoke sauna of sorts. They'd burn damp leaves or pine needles below decks, hoping the steam and smoke would kill germs and improve air quality. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. In fact, it often just made the ship smell like a forest fire and gave the crew headaches between the smoke and sweltering heat down below. This smoke sauna was so bad that Captain Anne Bonny herself supposedly banned it on her ship after a week, claiming it made her see strange things, none worthy of a lady, which in pirate terms probably means hallucinations from smoke poisoning. Instead, they landed on a more practical if less glamorous solution: seawater rinses followed by sun drying. Pirates learned that rinsing with ocean water helped rinse off grime and salt, and then carefully hanging any clothing to dry in the scorching sun reduced mold and rot, an early form of sterilization without meeting a doctor. Scientists today know that ultraviolet rays from the sun break down bacterial DNA, so by unknowingly turning their decks into an impromptu UV sterilizer, pirates protected themselves against infections better than some naval fleets equipped with so-called fresh water baths swarming with microbes. Another surprising hygiene hack came from the tropical environment itself. Pirates discovered that certain plants like neem and guava leaves had antiseptic qualities. Crew members stuffed these leaves into their clothing or bedding, and even used leaf-infused rinses to ward off skin infections and repel mosquitoes and lice, the real vermin who ran wild on pirate ships. Lice infestations were so common that some pirates reportedly shaved their heads, ending the fierce pirate mane look in favor of smooth scalps. Pretty pragmatic for a group famous for wild hair and beards. Getting back to navigation, pirates' ingenuity extended beyond bones in some truly peculiar directions before coming full circle. Before the bone sextant became a steady tool, pirates dabbled in candle barrels. Hollowed-out barrels with floating candles intended to cast a steady light and reflect off water surfaces, supposedly helping them gauge movement and direction during foggy nights. Again, bad idea. Really bad idea. Candles blowing out every time the ship rocked, barrels catching fire, and the general stink of melted wax and soaked wood turned the forecastle into what crew members called the fiery pit of doom. Not quite the lantern at the end of the tunnel they hoped for. Then there were attempts using crab shells as compass cards. Pirates noticed the natural curvature of crab shells aligned with Earth's magnetic tendencies and tried to magnetize them with bits of iron to guess direction. You can probably guess how that ended. The shells broke easily, the iron bits rusted, and the compass pointed southwest toward the galley more often than north, resulting in some unwanted detours to turtle-infested coves, because nothing says deadly and precise like a crustacean-based compass sending you into a crabby death trap. This trial and error wasn't just about getting lost or having worse meals. It was survival, plain and simple. Because when you're out on the ocean with a 100-foot wave ready to swallow you, and a crew desperately needing clean water, fresh food, and accurate navigation, you'll try anything, even carving skeletal remains into sextants, smoking out your own ship, or trusting crab shells to lead the way. Pirate life was an endless grim adventure of risking death and humiliation with creative hacks that, surprisingly, sometimes worked well enough to keep them one step ahead of the gallows and the watery grave. So next time you fancy a pirate story full of sword fights and gold chests, remember the real drama happened over salt-crusted bone tools, vinegar preservation, and pine resin barrels. Because the battle wasn't just for treasure, but for the simple chance to see another sunrise on the high seas. Pretty clever for a bunch of outlaws in tattered clothes armed with nothing but grit, guts, and a gnarly femur. Right. All right. So we left off with pirates turning human bones into their version of sextants to hack the impossible art of ocean navigation. But hold onto your tricorn hats, because this saga just keeps getting weirder and stranger, and funnier if you enjoy a little maritime madness. Now, the bone instruments solved a big piece of the puzzle, but pirates had a whole bunch more hurdles that could sink them faster than a cannonball in the Caribbean. Let's talk about the other nightmare: keeping the ship from falling apart and the crew from keeling over from hunger, thirst, or just plain old scurvy. Spoiler alert, pirates didn't exactly have Costco cruises or Amazon Prime deliveries. First up, let's dive into water management, which was less about fancy hydration and more a fight against desperation and death by dehydration. Picture 50 pirate souls sweating it out in the blazing sun, each guzzling roughly a gallon of water per day, which might not sound like a lot, but it adds up quickly when you're on a ship with just a handful of barrels. The Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's infamous flagship, carried a few hundred gallons max, but that only lasted about 2 weeks before it tasted like a sweaty gym sock left to ferment in a barrel. Pirates really had to stretch every drop like it was liquid gold, or better yet, liquid rum. Now here's where it gets tragically hilarious. One popular rainwater collection trick involved turning sails into giant soggy sponges, funneling the precious rain into barrels. But considering those sails had been soaked in sweat, bird droppings, and sea spray for weeks, the rainwater ended up being more like a microbial cocktail. Bad idea. Really bad idea. Let's just say some crew members' stomachs sounded like a voodoo drum circle after downing that fresh water. Remember, no one had invented water filtration yet, so catching rain meant catching everything nasty that had settled on the sails too. Pirates also tried to filter seawater through layers of sand, cloth, and charcoal, hoping to magically get drinkable water. Classic case of wishful science. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, because while charcoal and sand can remove dirt and some impurities, they can't remove salt dissolved in water. The result was a bitter, brackish gulper that tasted like licking barnacles. Crew morale plummeted, and a few desperate pirates started taking shots of sour lemon juice, because apparently they thought acid was a substitute for hydration. Talk about ruining your fearsome rep, wobbling on deck looking like limp lemons. But here's where their pirate ingenuity shines. Turns out the same pine resin they smeared on the bones to get a better grip also had microbial properties. Pirates began coating the insides of water barrels with pine resin, creating a crude but surprisingly effective antimicrobial seal. This helped keep bacteria colonies at bay and extended water freshness from a pitiful 3 days to almost a week. Not exactly spring water standards, but a godsend in the middle of the Atlantic. They'd also toss in charcoal scraps. Think of it as their version of a ragtag Brita filter, straining out sediment and gross bits before drinking. Not exactly the Ritz-Carlton spa water, but way better than salty misery. Meanwhile, that's only half the battle. Food storage on these ships was its own horror show. Pirates depended heavily on salted pork and beef, each preserved in 63-gallon barrels of salt brine, which, if you think about it, is like swimming in a gross meat pickle all month. Now, if the salting process was a little off, the meat didn't just taste bad, it grew maggots. These tiny wiggling worms were collectively known as the curse of the squirming bits, and they could ruin a pirate's appetite faster than a burst cannon. There's a hilarious recorded mutiny from the pirate ship Flying Dragon in 1695, where the crew went on a week-long strike because their salted beef was so maggot-infested that not even the most hardened cutthroat wanted to chew on it. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by refusing food like spoiled landlubbers. The solution: vinegar. Pirates found that soaking salted meat in a weak vinegar solution, about 3.5% acidity, the same concentration as apple cider vinegar today, stopped bacterial growth and kept flies and other pests at bay. It was like putting a natural preservative spray on their grog and grub, turning what would have been a biohazard into something borderline edible for weeks longer. This vinegar trick wasn't some grand invention, but more of a shared secret whispered from one salty crew to another, becoming standard practice on ships like the Revenge and the Adventure Galley by the late 1690s. So yes, even pirates understood the power of a little acid, who knew that vinegar was the unsung hero of the high seas. Let's not forget hygiene, which aboard 1696 pirate ships was less an afterthought and more an ongoing battle with germs, lice, scurvy, and a general sense of rottenness. Imagine dozens of men sharing one latrine bucket, clothes as clean as barnacle-covered rocks, and baths so rare they might as well have been myths. Pirates knew poor hygiene could kill you faster than enemy cannon fire or the hangman's noose, because sickness sapped the crew's strength, and dead men don't swing cutlasses very effectively. One infamous but ill-advised hygiene experiment involved creating a smoke sauna, where pirates burned damp leaves and pine needles below decks. hoping the combination of heat and smoke would kill germs and freshen the air. Bad idea, really bad idea. Far from disinfecting the ship, it turned the forecastle into what crew called the fiery pit of doom, filling the air with choking smoke and making people hallucinate. Captain Anne Bonny herself allegedly banned the practice after a week, saying it made her see strange things none worthy of a lady, which likely translates to, "I almost passed out." Because nothing says, fearsome pirate queen, quite like smoking out your own crew until they're too dizzy to fight. Pirates eventually landed on a more practical hygiene routine, rinsing with seawater followed by sun-drying clothes and bedding. Not exactly a spa day, but the sun's ultraviolet rays kill bacteria, acting as a rudimentary sterilizer. So unintentionally, pirates turned the entire ship deck into a UV sanitizing zone. Kind of impressive when you realize modern hospitals still use UV light for sterilization. And this practice helped reduce infections and prevent some of the mold and rot that was a constant problem in the humid, salty air. They also figured out tropical plants like neem and guava had antiseptic qualities. Clever pirates stuffed these leaves into their clothes and bedding or brewed rinse mixtures to fend off skin infections and repel the relentless mosquito and lice swarms. Lice infestations were so bad that some pirates shaved their heads, trading the iconic wild pirate mane for baldness, which is pretty practical if you think about it. Talk about a bad haircut saving lives. Back to navigation, because if you thought bones were as weird as it got, think again. Before settling on their skeletal sextants, pirates tried some truly bizarre and ill-fated experiments. One was the candle barrel, where they hollowed out barrels, floated candles inside, and tried to use the flickering light's reflection on water to detect the ship's course or movement in foggy weather. Bad idea, really bad idea. The candles kept blowing out on every wave, barrels sometimes caught fire, and the galley ended up smelling like a mix of melted wax and soaked wet wood, a combo less pirate brilliance and more floating disaster. The crew's description, the Fiery Pit of Doom sequel. So much for lighting the way. Another bizarre attempt was using crab shells as compass cards. Pirates noticed the natural curvature of these shells and tried magnetizing them with bits of rusty iron to create compasses. You can probably guess how that ended. The shells were brittle, cracked easily, iron bits rusted fast, and the compass pointed southwest toward the rum barrels rather than true north more often than not. Because nothing says deadly and precise, quite like crustacean-powered navigation leading you straight into a crabby death trap. These failures were more common than successes. But hey, you gotta admire the creativity of these salty sea dogs. All this trial and error wasn't just comedy of errors, it was survival. Because on the open ocean, facing monster waves and storms that could rip your ship apart, a shortfall in fresh water, rotten food, or a failed navigation method meant an agonizing end. Pirates lived on the razor's edge, and their mix of dead reckoning, superstition, and low-tech ingenuity kept them alive just a little bit longer. So, when you picture pirates, don't just think about swashbuckling and treasure maps. Think about grimy sea dogs squinting at femur bones with strings dangling like pendulums, rinsing off maggot-chewed pork in vinegar baths, scraping pine resin off barrels, and lighting hopeless candles in floating fire traps. Their successes were wild hacks born from desperation, their failures hilarious but deadly. And it all paints a picture far richer than the Hollywood swashbuckler cliché. Pirates were equal parts ingenious scientists, mad inventors, and definitely unluckiest sailors you'd ever hope to meet. In fact, here's the kicker. Some of their bone-based navigation methods actually foreshadowed real scientific advances that navies adopted decades later. Those rickety tools carved from human remains were more than pirate superstition. They were a testament to survival-driven innovation in an era without GPS, satellites, or even reliable compasses. Pirates held their own navigating by stars, bones, and a stubborn will to avoid the gallows. So next time you hear pirate, forget the parrots and eye patches for a second, and imagine a crew obsessively tallying marks on a skeletal femur, while trying not to vomit from vinegar-soaked pork or choke on pine needle smoke.